Picture this. It's the bitter winter of 973 after Christ, and you're huddled in what passes for shelter in medieval Norway. Now, when I say bitter, I don't mean the kind of cold where you complain about your heating bill. I mean the kind of cold that kills. Young Bjorn Kolsson pressed his face against his father's frozen chest in their smoke-filled longhouse near Trondheim. Think about that for a moment. His father, dead from the cold, right there in their own home. But here's the thing that really gets you. This wasn't unusual. This was Tuesday in medieval Scandinavia. 23 people huddled together in the darkness of that longhouse. 3 families, their thralls, and their dying livestock. All of them slowly freezing despite the central fire that consumed their precious wood stores like a hungry beast. This was Norway before the great innovation we're going to talk about. This was a time when each winter claimed 1 in 5 souls, and powerful jarls hoarded forest rights like they were made of pure gold. Now, let me paint you a picture of what these longhouses were actually like. Modern people, we think of our ancestors as tough, right? Vikings, hardy northern folk who could handle anything. But their buildings? Their buildings were losing a war against the cold every single day. Gaps between timber walls whistled with icy wind. Imagine trying to sleep while the wind literally screams through your bedroom walls. The earthen floor radiated frozen dampness that soaked through everything. And that smoke hole that should have provided ventilation? It was actually creating a chimney of escaping warmth, sucking the life right out of the building. Grandmother Astrid, I.S., now here's a woman who understood the stakes. She was the keeper of the sacred hearth for 40 winters. 40 winters! Think about what that means. She had watched winter try to kill her family 40 times, and she was still fighting. Every night, she performed the ritual of banking the coals while whispering prayers to Frigg for the family's survival. This wasn't superstition, folks. This was battlefield medicine, because by morning, ice would form on the inside walls of their home, on the inside, and someone else would have joined Bjorn's father in what they called the cold sleep. But here's where it gets really interesting from a historical perspective. This wasn't just about individual families struggling to survive. This seasonal death struggle shaped Viking society itself in ways that are absolutely fascinating when you really dig into them. Coastal jarls like Hakon Driftwood King, A.T. and yes, that was actually his name, controlled beaches where precious fuel washed ashore. Picture this. Driftwood was literally life and death currency. These guys demanded silver and daughters in exchange for warmth. Daughters? That's how desperate the situation was. You trade your child for enough wood to maybe survive another month. Meanwhile, inland chiefs guarded their forests with armed men. We're talking about a complex web of tribute and obligation based entirely on access to burnable wood. Think about that economic system for a second. The entire social structure revolved around who could keep you from freezing to death. The warmest halls attracted the finest warriors, while cold steadings lost their young men to richer lords who could promise survival through winter. Even their gods reflected this obsession with the eternal struggle between fire and ice. The Norse creation myth began with fire and ice locked in eternal conflict, with humanity trapped between them. When your daily reality is a battle between heat and cold for survival, of course that's going to show up in your religion. So there's young Bjorn, watching his mother struggle to keep his younger siblings warm with her own body heat. Can you imagine? Your own mother using her body as a human heater because that's all she has left. But something shifted in that young craftsman's mind that night. He had always been clever with his hands, learning from his father to shape wood and stone. But now, and this is the moment that changes everything, he began to see heat itself as something that could be shaped and guided, not just burned, not just consumed in this violent, wasteful way that had been killing his people for generations, but shaped, guided, controlled. That night, as his family grieved and shivered around his father's body, Bjorn Kolsson made a vow that would echo through the centuries. He would find a way to keep a longhouse warm through an entire winter without burning extra wood, or he would die in the attempt. Now, you might be thinking, okay, this is just one guy, one family, one tragic winter night. But here's the thing about innovation. about those moments when everything changes. They usually start with exactly this: one person, pushed to the absolute limit, refusing to accept that this is just how things have to be. Because what Bjorn was about to discover wouldn't just save his family. It was going to reshape the entire North, trigger wars, topple jarls, and ultimately change the course of Scandinavian history. All because a young man decided that winter didn't have to mean death. But first, he had to survive long enough to figure it out. And that meant leaving everything he knew behind and venturing into a world where the secrets of heat and stone were guarded more carefully than any treasure. Spring's arrival in 974 found Bjorn Coulson far from home, and I mean far from everything he had ever known. This wasn't some casual journey, folks. This was a desperate quest that took him across the whale roads and mountain passes in search of wisdom that might not even exist. Now, here's what's fascinating about Bjorn's approach. His quest didn't begin with dramatic battles or heroic confrontations. It began with something much more revolutionary for a Viking: careful observation. Think about that for a moment. In a culture that celebrated raiding and conquest, this young man chose to watch and learn. He studied Finnish smoke saunas where stones held heat for days. Days. Imagine heating up rocks and having them keep you warm for nearly a week. He examined Sami earth lodges that stayed comfortable with minimal fuel. These people had figured out how to live in the Arctic using less wood than his family burned in a single night. And he learned from traveling merchants who spoke of eastern buildings that channeled warmth like water flowing through streams. But the real breakthrough came in Uppsala, where he met a man who would change everything. Ingvar, the Greek traveller, had served in the Byzantine Emperor's Varangian Guard and seen the hypercaust systems beneath Constantinople's bathhouses. Now, picture this. A Viking warrior who had witnessed Roman engineering that could heat entire buildings through underground channels. Ingvar described massive bathhouses where hot air flowed beneath marble floors, keeping hundreds of people warm simultaneously. Though Bjorn couldn't read the Roman texts Ingvar mentioned, he grasped the fundamental principle that would reshape the North. Heat could be stored and moved through channels, multiplied through clever design rather than simply consumed like firewood in a bonfire. This revelation sent him north into the mountains, into territories beyond the reach of any jarl's authority. We're talking about places where hermits and outcasts survived winters that would kill normal men. These weren't just tough guys bragging about their endurance. These were people who had discovered secrets of survival that the mainstream Viking world didn't know existed. There, in a hidden valley that probably hasn't changed much in 1,000 years, Bjorn found the man who would teach him everything. Ulf the Wise. Though wisdom, as it turned out, hadn't saved the old man from dying slowly of lung rot. But Ulf had spent 20 winters perfecting what he called the breathing stones technique, learned from a Rus trader who had seen similar methods along the Volga. Now, here's where the story gets really interesting from a human perspective. As payment for Bjorn's care during his final days, 270, and think about this, a young man nursing a dying stranger through his last weeks, Ulf revealed his life's work, the secret he had guarded for 2 decades. The technique involved specific types of dense river stones, not just any rocks you might find lying around. These had to be heated in a precise sequence and arranged in channels beneath the floor and within the walls. When done correctly, they created a circulation of warm air that lasted for days with just one initial heating. Ulf demonstrated with a small model, and I want you to picture this scene. A dying old man, probably coughing up blood, showing a desperate young Viking how to create what he called the dragon's breath. Cold air drawn from floor level would pass over the heated stones, rise through carefully placed gaps, and create a continuous cycle of warmth. It was like the building itself was breathing, inhaling cold air and exhaling warmth. The key wasn't just in the stones, but in their arrangement. You had to understand airflow, heat retention, the properties of different stone types. The initial heating required only a normal day's worth of firewood, but the stored heat would radiate for nearly a week if the channels were properly sealed with clay and the stones correctly chosen. Think about what this meant. 1 day of normal fuel consumption for nearly a week of warmth. In a world where people died every winter from lack of heating fuel, This was like discovering fire all over again. As autumn approached, Bjorn returned to his village, armed with knowledge that would literally reshape the north. But here's where his intelligence really shows. He moved carefully. He understood that disrupting the firewood economy could bring deadly retaliation from those who profited from winter's grip. Remember, entire power structures were built around controlling access to fuel. His mother's longhouse became his testing ground, and I love this detail. He spent weeks arranging and rearranging stones while neighbors mocked his foolishness. Picture the scene. This young man, who had lost his father to the cold, obsessively moving rocks around while everyone laughed at him. They probably thought grief had driven him mad, but when the first snows fell and his family's home remained warm with half the usual wood consumption, mockery turned to amazement. And then, as word spread, amazement turned to something much more dangerous. Because in a world where warmth meant survival, and survival meant power, Bjorn Coulson had just upset the entire balance of Norse society. The poor craftsman's son had discovered something that could make the mightiest jarls irrelevant. The question wasn't whether this would lead to conflict. The question was how many people would die before the new knowledge found its place in the world. Word of Bjorn's miracle spread faster than wildfire through the fjords, and when I say miracle, I mean that's literally what people were calling it. By the winter of 975, desperate families travelled for days through snow and ice, just to see the impossible, a poor craftsman's longhouse warmer than any jarl's hall, using barely any fuel. Now, think about what this meant in practical terms. These were people who risked their lives making winter journeys because the alternative was freezing to death in their own homes. Some called it sorcery, others a gift from the gods, but all of them wanted to learn the secret that could save their families. Bjorn chose his students carefully at first, and this shows real wisdom. He taught loyal friends and struggling families while keeping the full technique hidden from those who would monopolize it. He understood that knowledge, this powerful, could be weaponized, turned into just another tool for the wealthy to control the poor. But you can't keep a secret this big forever, especially not in a world where information travels along trade routes and through warrior halls. The political explosion came when Jarl Hakon Driftwood King arrived with 50 armed men, demanding Bjorn surrender his secret or watch his family burn. Picture this confrontation. 50 warriors in mail and furs, bristling with weapons, surrounding the home of a craftsman who had committed the crime of figuring out how to stay warm. Hakon wasn't just being greedy, his entire power base depended on controlling access to driftwood fuel. If people didn't need as much firewood, what use was a driftwood king? But here's where the story takes a fascinating political turn. King Harald Bluetooth had also heard tales of the innovation, and his interest in anything that might strengthen his rule brought royal protection to Bjorn's door. Think about the strategic implications. A king whose subjects could survive winter more easily would have larger armies, more productive settlements, stronger tax bases. At the Great Hall of Trondheim, before an assembly of jarls and merchants, Bjorn demonstrated his technique by keeping the king's newborn son's chamber warm through a blizzard that killed horses in the stables. Horses, animals that are naturally much better equipped for cold than humans, dying in their shelters while a human baby stayed comfortable thanks to heated stones. The demonstration was politically brilliant, but it also painted a target on Bjorn's back. Success bred dangerous enemies, and the most dangerous was Thorkel Coldheart, a powerful jarl who controlled vast forest territories. Thorkel saw his influence crumbling as the need for firewood decreased, and he wasn't going to go quietly into irrelevance. Thorkel hired Wendish mercenaries, Kosmar, foreign fighters with no loyalty to local customs, one pope, to kidnap Bjorn and torture the secret from him. His plan was diabolically clever: learn the technique, then sell the knowledge only to the wealthy while keeping the poor dependent on his wood supplies. He would corner the market on both old heating and new heating. The raid came during the harvest festival, when everyone should have been celebrating and peaceful. But Bjorn's supporters, Bjornzar, who had started calling themselves Warm Keepers, fought back in a skirmish that left 12 men dead and started what the sagas would call the Warmth Wars. 12 dead men overheating technology. Think about that. This wasn't just about comfort or convenience. This was about reshaping the fundamental power structures of Viking society, and people were willing to kill and die for it. The conflict revealed deeper tensions that had been building for generations. Progressive jarls who quickly adopted the technique found their settlements growing as people flocked to warmer halls. Who wants to suffer under a lord who can't keep you from freezing when there's another lord down the fjord whose halls stay warm all winter? Meanwhile, conservative lords who resisted the innovation lost population and power. It was like watching an entire social order reorganize itself around a single technological advancement. The warmest halls attracted the finest warriors, the most skilled craftsmen, the most fertile families. Women became the primary teachers of the technique, and this is absolutely fascinating from a historical perspective. Women, traditionally responsible for maintaining hearth and home, suddenly found themselves holding knowledge that could make or break entire communities. They added their own refinements too, using different stones for cooking areas versus sleeping quarters, developing techniques for heating multiple rooms, creating systems that could warm both people and preserve food stores. The innovation even affected raiding patterns. Vikings could now launch earlier spring expeditions knowing their families would survive with less fuel gathering. Warriors could spend more time training and planning rather than desperately chopping wood. The entire rhythm of Viking life began to change. By 977, 3 competing versions of the technique circulated through Scandinavia. Bjorn's original method remained the most efficient, but regional variations emerged based on local conditions and materials. Coastal communities used rounded beach stones that held heat differently. Mountain settlements developed deeper channels for extreme cold. Danish lords created elaborate systems that heated multiple buildings from a single stone chamber. The knowledge became a form of currency itself, with traveling warmkeepers trading installation services for silver, cattle, and land. Imagine that career path, wandering from settlement to settlement, carrying the secret of staying warm, welcomed like a miracle worker, wherever you went. But with success came new dangers, because in a world where survival itself had become a commodity, Bjorn Coulson had made himself the most valuable and most vulnerable man in the north. And the worst winter in living memory was coming. The final chapter of Bjorn's story unfolded during the catastrophic winter of 1010 after Christ. And when I say catastrophic, I mean temperatures that would challenge even our modern heating systems. This was a winter so severe that the Baltic Sea froze solid enough for armies to march across. Armies, marching across what should have been open ocean. By then, Bjorn had grown old teaching his methods, his hair white as the snows he had conquered. Picture this man in his final years. From desperate young craftsman watching his father freeze to death, to the master teacher directing a network that would reshape the medieval world. From his workshop in Nidaros, he directed master builders who carried the breathing stone technique to every corner of the Viking world. And I mean everywhere Vikings had settled. From Iceland's isolated farmsteads, where families survived in volcanic wastelands that should have been uninhabitable, to the Rus settlements along the Dnieper, where Scandinavian traders built warm halls in the depths of the Russian winter. Bjorn's innovation had gone viral, medieval style. But here's what's really fascinating about the long-term impact. This innovation reached far beyond mere comfort. Think about the ripple effects. Warmer longhouses meant larger surviving families, which translated to more warriors for raids and more hands for farming. More people surviving winter meant bigger armies, stronger communities, more complex societies. The reduced need for firewood freed thousands of hours of labor each winter. Thousands of hours. Time that Vikings had previously spent desperately gathering fuel was now redirected toward crafting, storytelling, and planning expeditions. Shipbuilders could work through winter in heated halls, leading to improvements in vessel design that would eventually help Vikings reach North America. Even the character of Norse society shifted in ways that would have seemed impossible in Bjorn's youth. With less desperation around winter survival, communities developed more elaborate art, longer sagas, and deeper trade networks. When you're not spending all your time fighting for basic survival, You have energy left over for culture, for beauty, for the things that make life worth living. When Christian missionaries arrived in greater numbers after the year 1000, they found the breathing stone technique a useful tool for conversion. Smart missionaries, these guys. Monks adapted the system for their monasteries, seeing divine providence in technology that preserved life. They built the first heated scriptoriums, where scholars could work through winter copying manuscripts and developing the knowledge that would fuel the medieval Renaissance. The synthesis of pagan innovation and Christian record-keeping created something unprecedented, detailed manuals that documented exactly how to build these heating systems, ensuring the knowledge wouldn't be lost if key practitioners died. These texts would influence European heating methods for centuries, spreading the technique far beyond Scandinavia into France, Germany, and eventually throughout the medieval world. Bjorn Colson died peacefully in the winter of 1012, surrounded by 3 generations of his family in a longhouse warm as summer. Think about that image. The man who had started his journey holding his father's frozen corpse, ending his life surrounded by warm, living family. His last words, recorded by his grandson, revealed the philosophy behind his life's work. Fire fights ice with violence, and both are consumed. But guide the warmth like a gentle river, and it flows eternal. His funeral saw thousands gather despite a raging blizzard. Thousands. People travelled through deadly weather to honour the man who had freed them from winter's grip. Their procession was lit by torches, but warmed by the knowledge he had given them, a perfect symbol of how innovation can light the way forward, while practical wisdom keeps us alive. The Warmkeeper tradition survived the end of the Viking Age, evolving into medieval guilds of master builders who guarded and refined heating techniques. These guilds operated across Europe, carrying Scandinavian heating innovations into Gothic cathedrals, castle great halls, and monastery complexes. They became some of the most respected craftsmen in medieval society, holders of knowledge that could mean the difference between a thriving community and a failed settlement. Archaeological evidence from across Scandinavia shows the widespread adoption of underfloor heating channels and strategic stone placement lasting well into the 1400s. We can literally dig up the proof of Bjorn's impact: Reim, stone channels, clay seals, the physical remains of a revolution in human comfort that spread across an entire continent. Modern Scandinavian heating efficiency, the kind that makes contemporary Nordic countries the most energy efficient in the world, traces its roots directly back to Bjorn's innovation. That moment when one desperate young man chose to outwit winter rather than simply endure it, planted seeds that are still growing today. In Norwegian folk memory, extremely cold nights are still called Bjorn's test, honouring the man who transformed the North's relationship with its harshest season. When modern Norwegians joke about their heating bills or complain about a cold house, they're participating in a tradition that stretches back over 1,000 years to a young craftsman who refused to accept that winter had to mean death. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about Bjorn Colson's story isn't the technical innovation itself. It's what it represents about human ingenuity in the face of seemingly impossible challenges. Here was a young man with no formal education, no powerful connections, no wealth or status. He had nothing but grief, determination, and the willingness to learn from anyone who might know something useful, and he changed the world. That's the real legacy of the Dragon's Breath, not just warmer houses, but proof that innovation can come from anywhere, that one person's refusal to accept the status quo can reshape entire civilizations. In our modern age of global challenges and technological disruption, Bjorn Colson's story reminds us that the next world-changing innovation might come from the most unexpected place. From someone who simply refuses to accept that things have to be the way they've always been. Someone who looks at an impossible problem and says, there has to be a better way. Someone exactly like you.